Hi, everyone. Can you guys hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks so much for coming out on this first day of the fall semester. We have a really great group here and an incredible speaker. And our interim dean, Jorge Silva Puris, has joined us. And so I'd like to hand it off to him to welcome you all to this evening's event.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank you and your program and department, and also welcome and thank Assistant Commissioner Henry for dedicating time to sharing with our students and our staff your wealth of information and knowledge about the art world in New York. I am delighted to welcome all of you to this first day of the fall semester. Very, very excited to hear and learn about the great things that you will do during the semester, but even more excited about learning what you will do into the future. So a few years from now, I would love to go to a museum, whether it's here in the city or anywhere else in the world, and see some of you participating actively in the administration or in any other aspect of working at a museum or studying museums across the world. So Jenna, you have built a phenomenal program. I don't know if we have representatives from the New York Historical Society here with us tonight, but I also want to thank the Historical Society for their continued support on this program. You all are fabulous. We are very, very excited to have you, and I look forward to the presentation and the wise words from Assistant Commissioner Henry. So with that, I'll pass it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jorge. And with that, I am going to introduce our guest, an artist, curator, and cultural engineer who lives in New York City. Kendal Henry specializes in the field of public art. For over 25 years, Henry has seen public art as a tool for social engagement. His projects and programs have spanned the US, Europe, Russia, Asia, Central Asia, Papua New Guinea, Australia, and the Caribbean. Henry is an educator, having lectured for the Abbey Mural Workshop at the National Academy Museum and School of Fine Arts, at the Rhode Island School of Design Senior Studio, and at Pratt Institute's Arts and Cultural Management program. He's also an adjunct professor at NYU's Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. Henry served as the Director of Culture and Economic Development for the city of Newburgh, New York, where he created that region's first Percent for Art program. Prior to that, he was manager of arts programs at the MTA Arts for Transit, where he oversaw the commissioning, fabrication, and installation of permanent art projects, served as a member of the in-house design team, and produced temporary exhibitions at Grand Central Terminal. Henry was elected to 2 3-year terms on the Americans for the Arts Public Art Network Council. And for the past 7 years, he's been with the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, both as Assistant Commissioner of Public Art and Director of the Percent for Art program. Clearly, this amounts to a lot of experience. And tonight, Kendal Henry will be speaking about his observations regarding the processes and practices of public art. He's joined us, open to both sharing his experiences and listening to those of others. Please welcome our guest. Kendal, I've been so excited for this conversation. And so I'd like to start with some straightforward questions.
Thank you, Jenna, and thank you all for joining. And I just realized that this is the first day of school, and I don't know if I remember my first day of school. It was sort of like this moment of excitement coming out of the summer, I mean, I'd had my new outfit ready to go and, ready to meet the teachers and the students. It's still very exciting. So I don't know if people are still excited about that, but, it's just this joy always comes out of thinking it's the first day of class. And I'm happy to be here to share that with you today. So ask your question away.
I'm thrilled to have you here. It was by design. So it's my first question is kind of a two-part question, but we can keep them separate. First, I want to ask you how you define what it is that you do and how this differs from the work that you do for the city.
Okay. That's a good question, and it actually took me a while to know how to answer that question, because a lot of times in situations, people ask, what do you do? And I usually say artist, but then that doesn't cover a lot of the things that I do. And it depends on who's asking, will depend on how I answer. And so if I'm in a group of artists or something like that, and I want to stretch those limbs, I say, oh yeah, I'm an artist too. But if I'm with some arts professionals, then, saying I'm an artist in that situation has other connotations. So it all depends on where I am. So if I, to give you the long answer, I would tell you I'm an artist, I'm an arts administrator, I'm a public arts administrator, which is slightly different. I'm a project manager with some knowledge of construction. I'm a curator of different kinds, art curator versus public art curator. So you see how confusing it could be, right? It could be forever. So I decided to come up with my own explanation or definition to sort of hopefully ball all that into one. And that's why I came up with cultural engineer, right? And so it sort of really makes more sense to me in terms of how I use what it is that I know in terms of the world of art and in terms of the world of public art. So when somebody asks, how do you define yourself? I say I'm a cultural engineer, and what people know of the word culture and what people know of the word engineer really makes sense in terms of trying to explain that. And it's easier for me to explain that than to go along this whole long row of different definitions and ideas. So that's how I define myself, and how that fits within my day job fits really well also. But my day job as the assistant commissioner at public art is very specific in what I do. I'm going to take a minute to explain some of that. So a lot of people don't know, I work at the Department of Cultural Affairs. And I bet you I ask any one of you what that means, and you've probably heard of it before, and you probably don't know. And when people are interviewing for jobs here, that's one of the first questions we ask them. What do you think the Department of Cultural Affairs does? And you get many different kinds of answers. But at the end of the day, we're a funding agency, actually. We fund every aspect of art and culture in New York City. So we are the largest funder of art and culture outside of the federal government. It might be more, depending on what year it is. And it's around $400 million a year on art and culture in New York City. So next time you go to a play in a small neighborhood, in the museum, look for the sponsors of that, those activities or that space, and you will see our logo. And so that's who we are. So within that, I run what we call the public art unit. There's a number of units that take care of what we call the cultural institutions. These are the big institutions like the Met. We have a programs unit that takes care of the smaller organizations in terms of funding. And then we have the public art unit. So under that umbrella, and this is going to be a long answer, I run a number of programs, and one is the Percent for Art program. And if you don't know what that is, in the 80s, and if some of you were around in the 80s or know of the 80s, this will be incredible to understand. A law was passed that basically says that 1% of anything that the city is building, 1% of it must go to the commissioning of a work of art. New York City was quite awful in the 80s in terms of almost being bankrupt, and just to sort of allocate funding for art at that time is an incredible kind of feat. And so that program was started then. And so what that does is we commission permanent public art that is embedded within that facility. It could be a park, it could be a school, and anything. And right now I'm working on about 135 of these types of projects. So that's one program. A more specialized version of that is the Public Art for Public Schools program. And this is where we commission art for schools. There's so many schools being built in the city. There's so many schools that are additions to those are being built in the city. And so we commission art in those spaces. And the community in these spaces are quite special. And so, and the types of artwork we put in those spaces need to be special in that some of these schools don't have art programs. And so the artwork could serve a dual purpose of being part of the curriculum, using art to as a tool, and you're going to probably hear me say this word tool quite a bit, as a tool to teach a lot of the other subjects that may not seem to be related to art. So a lot of the artworks end up being part of the curriculum for science and math and social studies and all the other subjects that are never going to be cut when budgets are meant to cut programs within schools. So that's another program. We have something called the Public Artist in Residency program that I also run. And this we call PAIR for short. And this is where we embed artists in city government. So to influence policy. So this is an idea where artists are in non-art spaces to really find creative solutions to problems within those agencies. So we're in the throes right now of picking our next cohort of artists for a number of city agencies. One being the Department of Design and Construction, how artists will influence what happens when people are, in communities are being torn apart by construction, and how do artists relay that conversation with the communities. We're working with the Department of Homeless Services to really change our perception of what it means to be homeless. We have very negative, connotations of homeless people. And so an artist is meant to really change our perceptions of that. We're working with the Department of the Mayors to prevent domestic violence, and so we're embedding artists into those spaces to help those agencies communicate with their constituents to understand how to better serve their constituents or the people, in certain instances, the clients that is part of the New York City culture. So that's another program that I'm working on that's under my umbrella. There's something called City Canvas. Again, if you stand in any place, I guarantee you stand anywhere in New York City and you do a 360, chances are you'll see a construction site. And within those construction sites, there are a lot of scaffolding. So we have a specific program to cover that scaffolding with artwork. And so that's the City Canvas program. We have another program called PACE, which is Public Art as Community Engagement. This is where we use public art to specifically engage the community around difficult issues. We pair that program, the PACE program, with our permanent art program with the more difficult types of projects that we have to work with. So think for a minute, we're putting the city is putting a sewage treatment plant in a community. Nobody wants that. And so how do we use art to communicate about the community's desires, needs, opposition, to communicate with the city about putting this facility in their space, or a jail? Nobody likes jails in the communities. On some communities, police stations. So we use those programs to engage in those communications ahead of that program. So that's another one of our programs. And the last is the Monuments and Memorials programs. So a couple of years, like 3 years now, the mayor at the time, wanted to really evaluate who's represented in our city. And looking at the collection, we saw that most of the representation in our monuments and memorials were of white men. This is very typical of monuments throughout the world, frankly. And so we made a concerted effort to start to change that. And by initiating a monument program, as well as a sub-monument program called She Built NYC, which will focus primarily on women. So very long answer to your simple question as to what do you do for the city versus what do you do on your own. So these are the programs that I run with a fantastic staff, and what I do, how I describe myself when I say I'm a cultural engineer. All that description goes into every single one of those programs. to make sure they are on some level, hopefully, knock on wood, successful.
So a little aside, Percent for Arts actually funded a lot of CUNY's own holdings, art collections that various campuses own, and a significant portion of those of the artists represented in that collection are faculty of color. So faculty were teaching at CUNY campuses. Their artwork is now part of the CUNY collection because of Percent for Art. So as someone who started out life training to be an artist, how did you find your way into this kind of work?
Yeah, it wasn't on purpose. Not that it was actually a bit of a fluke, right? So I went to art school. I actually went to School of Visual Arts, and we intermingled with some of the CUNY students around Baruch area there, and as part of and I had to get financial aid, and as part of our financial aid program, there was something called work study. So you had to, to get that funding, the aid, you had to do some sort of work. So I remember going into the office, and there was a huge binder of possible places for employment. And as you could imagine, most of it was not art related. And so I wanted to find something that was art related. And there was this one sort of job, and it was actually here at the Department of Cultural Affairs when it was located somewhere else. And it said something like, public art intern or something like that. And I'd never really heard the term before. And, going to art school, you kind of, the word public art had like not a negative connotation, but it was sort of like, art for the public, art for everybody. And it sounds like it would be a watered down version of art. But when you think of it, like, public transportation versus your private car, public restroom versus your own bathroom, anything with public in front of it has this semi-negative connotation, or it's sort of like less than, or, whatever. And so that was my initial thought, but I went anyway. And so I went for the interview, and, being an art student, it's like, sure. And it was a very small staff, and they're like, we'll take any help we can. And so I started interning there. And one of the things at the same time, while going to art school, there was something about having exhibitions in school, and the people coming, or just your friends, your family, you kind of like preaching to the converted. You weren't getting these interesting audiences to sort of counter some of the statements you're making in your artwork. And that was getting a bit boring for me. And then I realized, well, oh, this public art thing, you're introducing artwork to people who are not interested in art, who don't necessarily know, have any kind of art history background or know anything about art. And so what would that be like to create something and have that kind of dialogue with somebody? Because, as artists, we think we're creating things that are important to be said, right? And so, but having the conversations with your peers is not as interesting as having conversations with people who are have an opposing view, or basically different view than you. So the idea of this concept of, oh my goodness, there's a whole agency that is, dedicated to making this kind of art to, people, that's incredible. And, I was like, I was hooked immediately. What was also interesting was I was in charge of the registry. This is where artists would submit work to be considered. And flipping through the registry, I noticed that a lot of my instructors were part of part of that group. They wanted to be part of those conversations. And I thought that too was interesting. The people that I admired, the people that were teaching me, wanted to sort of have those kinds of conversations as well. And so I started really diving deep into what that was. Because it was a small staff, I wasn't doing intern work. I was doing work of a real, employee, and started doing actually school projects. One thing led to another because I had experience. Once I graduated, there was a job opened up, and I slided right into doing that kind of work as a real employee doing public art, and that was history. So that's how it got started. So, and interestingly enough, all of my, I was just thinking about this as I said it, all of my staff right now have been interns on some level in public art before being hired as a public art person, because I think the knowledge that you acquire through a mentorship or an internship or apprenticeship is a lot more valuable than what you could learn in a class or through books, because the nuances of any situation is sort of where a lot of the knowledge comes from. So I just actually realized that when, as I said it, that, oh, everybody here was an intern. So
Accident favors the prepared mind, right? Uh, so this is kind of a good segue, I think, to talk a little bit more about your own work. You you actually, when talking about your work and when others speak about your work, the word entrepreneurial comes up a lot. You have an entrepreneurial approach to this field. Can you talk a little bit about how that impacts the focus of your work?
yeah, and I think it sort of became entrepreneurial, sort of like in the same way what I was trying to figure out um, when somebody asked me that question, like, what is that you do? And I had to come up with a new term, so to speak. I think within any field, within the art field, within the public art field, there may be things that you want to focus on more than others, right? Or there may be things that you see there is a hole where that needs to be filled with, whether it be perspective wise or in terms of diversity or whatever. And so though I was very interested in the public art realm, even then it was mostly, again, most of the folks that were doing the public artwork had the education, had the experience, were white men in that particular instance. And so how and their voices were echoed over and over again with the public artworks. And of course, when you're creating public artwork, you talk about what you know. And so one of the things that I was interested in was how do I give voice to the voices that we don't hear from often, right? And so what do I have to, what skills do I have personally that I could apply to, creating this approach, this, entrepreneurship of an approach, and how can I practice it? And so I started to think about not just the knowledge that I've acquired through schools and experiences and whatnot, but my perspective as a Black immigrant individual, male in America. How can I apply that to others who are less, that we don't hear from as often? And so that began sort of the journey, so to speak. And then what are the skills that I have? I'm a good listener. I like to listen to people speak. And it's interesting that I'm actually doing this because I don't like to talk about myself. I like to be in the background, but I'm doing it for you, Jenna. So I applied all these things and sort of made up the job, or made up the niche of the job that I was both interested in, and I felt that I had a validity to speak towards. So that's how that started.
For our students and our alum, because I think your pathways, when you've forged yourself, and you've made choices and taken opportunities, but you've molded them into a larger picture. And at one point in time, you said, if a job doesn't exist, make it.
Yeah, exactly. And exactly. And again, the job that I was doing at the time, or I'm doing now to a certain extent, didn't really exist. So I had to sort of make it up. Just like I made up my, the cultural engineering title. And really thinking about, what do I like to do? and I think this may sound really cliche, and then people always say, do what you like, and so what do I like to do, and how can I use some of that to push forward some of these ideas? And so I like to travel. I mean, I love traveling for many different reasons. I'm thinking a lot of people do. So whenever I would travel somewhere, I would take a few moments to do a little research and to see, is there anyone that's doing things that I'm doing, or doing things that I'm interested in? And, let me contact them and say, hey, I'm going to be, in your neighborhood, I'm going to be in your country, in your city, whatever, can we meet and have a conversation? And 99% of the times people are like, oh, sure, because this exchange of ideas and knowledge and experiences is something that's very human and very kind of, universal. So as a result of that, and when you embarrassingly read my bio, you had all these different countries listed out there. This is how they actually literally started. I went to Australia on a vacation to somebody's wedding, and I was like, oh, I wonder what they're doing with art here. And I went to this local council and said, hey, this is who I am. I wasn't anybody of any importance per se, but I'm an artist, and I see you doing this, and just from that conversation, they're like, oh, this is a different approach. This is interesting. Can you try to do this, and let's see what happens there? And so that led to a project or a collaboration, or a conversation, and it sort of goes both ways. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, but I'm still learning, and I think that approach and that humbleness to understand, well, yes, though you may be an expert in something, there's still opportunities to learn. And so I approach everything like that. And so again, I like to travel, so I incorporated that. I like art, so I incorporated that. I like to listen, so that's part of my practice. So, it's all, what I like, and so it doesn't feel like a job.
You've just given me a great segue. As you just noted, a lot of your experience has been international. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and possibly talk about some of your observations that speak to your views on why public art works, why it matters? In past conversations, you've brought up a number of just really powerful examples through your experience.
Yeah. So now today, I continue to do international work for a very I won't say practical reason, because of my job, because of my standing in the arts community. I cannot really do anything here in New York City. Everything becomes a conflict of interest. In my practice, I'm a collaborator. I'm an artist as instigator, artist as I like to sort of coordinate and collaborate, and so I can't really do anything here. Otherwise, it becomes so to be able to do that, I go elsewhere. And but I'm also interested in, I preach that public art is a tool. It could be used for many different things, and I want to practice that as much as possible. I want to experiment with that idea as much as possible. And so a lot of what I do as an artist ends up being in countries where I'm not familiar with culturally. Sometimes I'm illiterate in those countries because I don't speak the language. And so that's a fantastic challenge to have. And so let me take a moment to describe what my practice is so people could understand. So what I do is I don't know what to call it just yet, but it's an exercise in creativity. So I would either be invited, or I just go on my own to a place where I may be a little familiar or not familiar at all, and to do an art project. And so I would go, and let's say I'm invited, and I would go and I'd say, well, can I get some people to work with? I would do a call and say, hey, I'm an artist from New York. I want to do a project here. Is anybody interested in doing something with me? And most often than not, there are many people who says yes. And so it's been collaborations with 5 people, and I've collaborated with around 300 people on a project. And so I usually give myself about a week. The most has been 10 days. And the first meeting is really about getting to know each other, like a conversation. You know, the word art probably doesn't come up in that conversation. It's more about, you know, what are some of the things that's on top of mind? Or what are some of the things that are interesting about where you live and who you are, and what makes you laugh and cry and happy? What are some of the things that you want to talk about to a guest, a stranger in your midst, so to speak? And whatever that is, it becomes the topic of an artwork. And it's sort of like, well, let's do an artwork about this. For example, I went to Dushanbe, Tajikistan, where I did this practice. And in Dushanbe, we had this conversation, and a lot of people talking about the lack of access to water. What is odd about that is, if you know anything about Dushanbe, it's 98% mountainous, and the city of Dushanbe is in the valleys, which means, you know, every spring the snow melts, and the city is inundated with water in the rivers and in the lakes and whatnot. And so for them to not have access to water was an incredible thing. And so that's what people want to talk about. Let's talk about water and access to water, not access to water. And I said, well, let's do a project about water. And each of the people that I work with had a different skill levels, right? So some of them were artists, some of them were just lay folks, and some of them may have been poets or graffiti artists or whatever. And I collaborated with each of them. And of course, my level of collaboration with each of them was very different, in that some, you know, it was just a pure collaboration where we coming up with the idea together. Others were, I'm just sort of there to guide you through an idea that you might have. And so long story short, we ended up doing about 25 different projects that's related to water. And I'm going to describe a couple of them to you. One was called a water bar. And so one artist created a bar, just a very simple, where would set up in the market and would invite, you know, the community to sample water, to taste the water from, and each water was from a different place. So to sample American water, sample local water, Tajik water, water from the UK, and the question was, which of these waters taste the best, right? And the majority of the people say, well, American water tasted the best, or, you know, water from elsewhere tasted best, but which is the worst tasting water was the local water. And when they revealed that the local water was the least tasting water, they say, oh, by the way, you've been tasting the whole water the whole time. None of these waters are different. It's coming from the same source. So that allowed to engage in that conversation about, why do you think the grass is greener on the other side? What about that? And that engaged in this artwork engaged in this conversation about water that way. Another project was canned water. Okay, so we were able to can water and hand it out for free. But the thing about canned water is, you either need to buy a very expensive can opener, or, you know, rub the can along the street or sidewalk for quite a long period of time to break the seal to get access to the water. And the conversation around that was, yes, you have access, you get it for free, but to get actual access to it requires a lot of work and a couple of expenses, and that engaged in another kind of conversation. So there are 25 different projects like that, that was purely meant to engage in a conversation about access to water and all that kind of things. And so the individuals that I'm working with came up with these ideas. They created them, and what happened was, because I was a foreigner in the space, it got a lot of attention, the project. And I'm very aware of that. And so these artworks travel throughout Tajikistan and engage a lot of conversation around the access to water. And it took 5 years, but the access to water was increased as a result of those projects. So these are the types of projects that I like to do, where it's really thinking about the long game, really thinking about empowering people to change their own, you know, circumstances through art. A lot of times, none of these people realize that these things were art objects, or you would consider them art objects. But that's, you know, and I forgot what the question was, but I'm like rambling onto something. But yeah, so that's a typical type of idea of a project that I do, and I've done quite a few of them, and they're all very different.
And they're occasionally quite long term, whether you intend them to be or not. Last year you return to a project in Siberia that you started in 2005.
Yeah,
Um,
and so there's, and I forgot to say a couple of things about these projects. So when I do go, there was this, it's important that I don't bring any resources with me, right? It's sort of like, and use the resources that are available and really work with very little funding, let's say. So each of the water projects that I just described, the budgets was the equivalent of about $20. That's all people had to work with. So, artists don't have that kind of money to be, spending on some art project. Most people really don't. They actually have lives to lead. So, so it's always important that the limitation of time and financial resources is part of the conversation and part of the projects as well. But yes, so but there's always this goal to not it just be about the project, and once I'm gone or the project is over, that's the end of it. There's always this this desire, this built-in sort of learning aspect, tool teaching aspect within it. So and in our conversation before, I think I consider a lot of the artworks that we see out there, the public artworks, I call them artifacts, because they're just the result of something I think is much more important, that interaction with the community, with an artist, with a space that happens throughout the process. And some of these processes takes years, and then the end result is, of course, the artifact of that. And so that's how I approach all these projects. So the project that you're referring to that I started in 2005 and going to revisit it last year in 2021, and it having to it took on many different iterations on its own, is sort of like it doesn't happen very often, but it was happy to see that some of the experimentations, and they are experimentations that I started with, reap a lot of benefits in the end.
In discussing some of these projects, you often emphasized the importance of flexibility and how experimentation is built into this process, naturally. But even the long-term projects have to come to an end. So what makes a project successful for you?
That is always a question for public art. How is it successful? And and back in the day when we first started, when I say we, the universal we of experiment with public art in the 60s, 80s, whatever. And I wasn't around in the 60s, I'm not that old. But a lot of the levels of success was that, is it there the next day? So if you put the artwork up and it's still there, and the community or whoever didn't tear it down or vandalize it, that was a measure of success, right? That is not the case now. Now, before we even begin to start a public artwork, we start with a framing question. What is this art meant to do? Why are we doing this in the first place? Why is this important? And now that gives us a starting point or a measuring point by which, at the end of it, that question answered. That's one way to measure that success, right? Sometimes you cannot see the success of a project until many years later, particularly permanent ones where they're meant to be in the public environment for like 100 years, and so you don't get to see it for a while. But I think going back to that idea of the end result, again, this is my idea and my thought and how to think about these things, that the end result is just the artifact. A lot of times when you go back and working with communities in creating the artwork, having these conversations with these individuals, understanding, what new knowledge that has been learned as part of that process, what new relationships has been forged, how new ways of seeing has come about. All these things, I think, are a measurable level of success in a public art project. And some of us may never even know that. Half the time I don't know that until you sort of go back, but when you see, and I think garnering ownership of a project is also key as a level of success. When people feel like they're a part of creating it, they own it. When people feel like they were a part of a process, it was conceived from their conversations and their ideas, it's theirs and they own it. So that means that they take care of it. That means that they want to share it. And all that becomes part of what considered a measurement of success in a public artwork. And I'm talking about all this stuff, and it sounds like great. He's done all these fantastic projects, but this is many years of making many mistakes, and making many bad decisions about many different things. I mean, I could have a whole lecture on just the mistakes, but which I've done a couple of times. But that is very important. And as I said that, I'm just thinking about 3 or 4 horrible mistake projects that I've done that has many lessons learned as a result of that. And I might share 1 or 2 with you, but yeah, so that's one way there's many different ways of measuring success, from is it there the next day, to did the people feel that it's theirs, that they take care of it, they feel ownership to it, to all the residuals as that happens throughout from the process of creating the work as well.
I think everybody likes to hear about stories of mistakes, but to let you a little bit off the hook on that one,
No, I don't mind
I'll-
sharing. I don't mind sharing, because I think
then please.
which one?
Well, you and I discussed people coming into projects with expectations about what public art is and how that undoes things, or participants in the process who devalue their own voice. I'm not an artist, but those are smaller things, I think, than.
Yeah, so I think in the processes, the way I do things now is a result of a lot of things that I've done in the past that didn't work out, or was just very wrong. One of the things I think, I'm going to talk about 2 projects. One about what is community and defining community, and the other is giving people the space to feel safe to create the work. And first, I'm going to talk about the space one. So one of the first types of projects I was doing was schools, right? And so I did a school many years ago in Upper Manhattan, and schools are the easiest types of projects to do. And the reason why they were the easiest is because you kind of know the audience. They're going to be these students and the faculty and the community of that school. It's rooted within a space, and you could sort of go outward and see who lives here and who are they and whatnot. So these are relatively easy types of projects. And they're going to be educational, and so it's like there's an outline of what could make a successful school project. So we selected an artist to do I'm not going to name names, to do a project, and not to the artist anyway, but I'm still not going to name names, to do a project in this school. And he created this, you could probably Google it after I say what it is and figure who it is out, but he created this project in the school, which was it's elementary school in Upper Manhattan, Washington Heights. And the project was really tapping into the wonder of childhood, but making reference to art history at the same time in a very cool way. So the project was a 12-foot chair, a school chair that you would see in the school, painted red, and on top of it was a horse, like a pinto horse. So he's making reference to the equestrian sculptures that we see everywhere, but really thinking about child and their small stature and this big, and playing with scale. Chairs are not usually that big. Horses are not usually proportionate to the chair. So it's just that really sort of playful kind of thing. And it also turns out that, the artist had a young son at the time. And, he got the idea from seeing his child play with his toys, and how they, using toys to make other sculptures by stacking them on each other. It's like, oh, this is, and, made the connection. So we went through the process. It's a 3-year process. We commissioned the artwork. And then we placed it in the courtyard of the school, and it was like, oh, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a beautiful piece. How could it be not controversial? We always look for controversial things, and which is a good and bad thing, but that's another topic. And so going back to the office, celebrating, yay, one is done, and get a call from somebody from the community and said, this needs to be removed immediately. We're like, what? What is wrong with it? It's like, and no, so if you've ever been to a community board meeting, when people don't like something, everybody comes and let you know exactly if I didn't like something, right? That's just a community board meeting. So we went to this community board meeting for about 2 hours. It seems like everybody in that community lined up to say something negative about the work. And it was like, red is a violent color. There's a lot of violence in this community, and, or I don't understand what it means. So there's all these different statements being made by that community about the project that didn't warrant its removal. Somebody, it's red. Okay, well, it's you don't understand the play of scale. But towards the end of that evening, someone came and said, listen, I need to tell you what the actual problem is. For 20 years, we've been trying to get this school built. And for 20 years, there's a dean across the street that's part of this yeshiva that prevented it from it being built. He said, I don't want a school being built because these kids are animals. And so now, not being privy to that information, we placed an animal on a school chair, and that reminded people of the 20 years of this trauma of being their Hispanic kids being called animals. So the lesson that was learned there was, if you really want to engage the community, you need to engage them in their space. You need to create that safe space that they feel comfortable letting you know these things that are horrible, traumatic things for them. You need to do it in their space. They can't be coming to the middle of downtown somewhere in some office building at, in the middle of the day to be part of this process. You have to sort of do it in their space. You have to sort of create the trust between the community so you can know these things. We've been working on this for 3 years. They had seen the project before, but nobody felt that we were open enough, we were comfortable enough, we created a safe enough space for them to be able to say, you know what, this is going to be a problem for us. So after hearing that, we immediately removed the sculpture of this horse in the chair, and it now lives in a whole other state in front of a children's museum, where it is, and a new work was commissioned for the school that was sort of more appropriate to that community. So that's the lesson. And so whenever we do a project, we make sure it's done in the safe space. We make the community determine how and when and who and all that kind of thing, instead of us sort of taking on that role and doing that. So that's one of them, of these lessons learned from something that happened in that particular instance.
Ouch.
Yeah.
I think anyone who's done community engaged or directed work or research has had an experience that was like that, but their own. I appreciate you being willing to share yours. We have a bunch of other questions we could get to, but there are a lot of questions showing up in the chat. And so if it's okay with you, Kendall, I'd like to start turning to those. And if we run out of questions there, we can return to some of our others, if that's all
I'll
right.
give you more stories. Yes.
That sounds great. We can talk about community all day work, all day. Community-based work all day. So I'm just going to go through the ones that have come in. If folks who have posted them in the chat, posted questions in the chat, if you would like to ask them, please raise your hand when I read it, and our fabulous team will unmute you and you can ask your question. If you do not want to ask it yourself, I can just read it on your behalf. Thanks for coming, Eileen. So she's asked a practical question, and I know you like practical questions. How does public art really differ from private art? What?
Yeah. So I think there's two parts to that define a difference. In that, maybe three. In that, access is one. So for public art to be public art, access needs to be free, not necessarily physical access, but it could be visual access as well. Something that is key to public art is site specificity, where it's made for the site. It's made to be integrated within the site, and integration is another really, universal word. But the best, and I do the air quotes with the word best, type of public art is if it's removed from its original location, or the location it's meant to be created for, it will no longer make sense, right? So so that's another component of it. And my own definition, or not necessarily definition, but one of the factors that I think is important in public art that's not necessarily in key to private art, if you want to call it that, is the melding together of community, and which means audience, the art, and the space. So each one of these things have equal footing on its creation. So
I always love asking you just straightforward, practical questions because your answers are so
Kendall,
engaging.
this is Eileen. I do want to ask you about the importance of public opinion when you deal with public art, because sometimes by removing a piece of art, you're really not helping the public to understand the art. So, what is your responsibility when it comes to public opinion and public art?
mhm. And Eileen, I've had to deal with that on many different levels. And I have a personal opinion, and then a business opinion, so to speak. So I always think that it's very, very, very super important, for, this is my personal opinion, for it to remain, well, it depends on what, this is very kind of like, I'm going to be sketchy here, to sort of at least keep it up with enough time for proper engagement to happen around why it should be removed, right? So we've had a couple of projects. I'm going to name a project. We have a project which is a sculpture of a pink figure in Queens, in Long Island City, Queens. Before it was even installed or fabricated, there was an uproar as to it should not be there because of its cost, its design. We got somebody called it Gumby's grandmother, but we put it up anyway because we felt that the conversations around the work needed to happen. It's been up for like 6 years or so. In the beginning, it was so controversial that there were people saying it should never be made and whatever, but we did it anyway because and now it's like it's an icon in the community. It's weird, but I think it's important for those conversations to happen, and I think time needs to it needs to have time for these conversations to happen, not some sort of visceral reaction of the moment, because what we found out during those conversations was it wasn't about the artwork, it wasn't about the cost of it, it was about what it represented to that community. It represented gentrification, because that was a sign of gentrification, right? Which was a valid point. So how do we use the artwork to really have these conversations that wasn't being had before the artwork came, that needed to be had, I think is very key. So, and I'm not going to give my work response, but I think I'm less in favor of quickly removing something unless there's a lot of conversation around it prior to its removal. And maybe a decision is to be made, well, yes, we've exhausted all we need to say about this after 5 years of talking, let's take it down because it needs to be removed. So I hope that answered your question.
Thanks, Kendall. EY, you've posted a two-part question. Would you like to ask it yourself? Oh, you're gonna make me ask it. Okay. Darn it. All right. I have two connected questions. EY Zippers is one of our faculty, and she teaches our museum education, one of our museum education courses. She's been with us for a while now. So her question is, I have two connected questions. Is there a timeline for Vinnie Bagwell's replacement of the J. Marion Sims Monument? And is there going to be a round 2 of the Monuments Commission report?
So Vinnie Bagwell's project is ongoing, and we're still in the early phases of design. So this is a standalone project, so we don't have a specific timeline. One thing, at the completion of one thing will determine the next step for the other thing. So it's ongoing, it's happening. The phase 2, so phase 1 happened in another administration. What happens in phase 2 is to be determined. So I can't give you an answer to that.
Okay, so next is an old and dear friend, David Byertire. Would you like to ask your question? There we go.
I said yes, and it's a pleasure to see you again, Jenna.
It's been forever.
It has been a very long time, and Kendall, I would like to say, again, thank you for this opportunity to actually speak to you regarding my question, which is, does the social and political climate of New York City influence your selection of artists and the kind of art that you fund? And could you provide an example of which the artist or the art selection reflects such an issue? Because I know that sometimes, outstanding issues require some type of response to validate either the outrage or the celebration of something that shapes the climate of the city. Could you provide some examples in which you responded immediately to those to that climate?
So it's not very possible for us to respond immediately. And the reason why is most of what we do is commission permanent public art, right? And so we come in very early in the design process of whatever that infrastructural project is, which means before ground is broken, at least 3 years have passed between when an artist is selected and the thing begins to be built. So to respond immediately, it's something that's harder to do. That being said, we don't give artists themes by which they need to respond to. We don't give them any thoughts, ideas as to what we're looking for in what they need to create an artwork around, except if it's for like a monument or something. But we have found that artists tend to talk about through their artwork what is on their mind and what's happening now anyway. So for example, right after 9/11, we commissioned a lot of artwork that for anything, for buildings and whatnot. And if you look at them closely, you would see little bits of pieces and remnants that refer back to that. There's a piece in the Prince Street subway station, for example. There is a series of small people carrying things, and the work is called Carrying On. And that was really influenced by what happened after, how New York City was after, if you see when the pieces were made, how New York City was carrying on as a result of that. If you look closely at a project in Queens Plaza, you would see where a lowered flag and a little echo of a sun where the World Trade Centers used to be. So artists are putting these little, tidbits and hints as to of the time. Some of it is subtle and some of it is not so subtle. But we don't determine. We don't say, we're going to pick you for this. We just say we're picking you to do this. what are some of the things that you want to address in these kinds of projects, and it happens, and it's allowed to happen. Sometimes there's a piece called Unity by Hank Willis Thomas on the other side of the Brooklyn Bridge on the Brooklyn side. And that is very telling as to, it's done by, if you don't know who Hank is, he's an African-American artist, and the arm itself is purposefully a Black arm, that when you see it as it's meant to be seen by anyone, it sort of is raising up the single finger. Is it saying we're number one? Is it pointing to God? What is that gesture? But a little secret, if you stand in one particular spot and look at the arm, you see this. It's sort of doing the Black Power symbol. So there's a lot of different ways that artists are doing these kinds of things that may not be obvious, may needs to be discovered, but and again, and that piece became a meeting point during the protests around the murder of George Floyd, for example. It became, a symbol in a lot of the films that were made around that time as well. I know Spike Lee had it in one of his films celebrating the city as well. So all these things happen that just happens naturally because that's what artists are thinking about, and artists are thinking about what's happening in their world at the time. But we don't control content. That's your question.
Next we have Devin Rudolph, and I
Yep.
think there you go, elected to ask your own. Go ahead.
All right. Hi, Kendall. I'm Devin Rudolph, they, them, and here's my question. So when you encounter creative blocks, how do you approach and come up with solutions to get past them?
I take a walk. I go see art. I have conversations with other artists. I read. I mean, that's how I do it. And sometimes it doesn't work. But I have some trusted individuals or individuals whose either work or whose opinions who I cherish, and that becomes part of our conversations. And that usually ends up being a good idea. So yeah. So when I have a block, I said I'm trying to get out of this or whatever, and the walking and the the sleeping and the watching TVing and that sort of thing doesn't work. Then it's like, let's have this conversation. Let's sort of debate and converse about it, and that usually works in the end.
Thank you so much. That was simple but effective. I appreciate hearing about that. Thank you so much for answering that.
You're very welcome.
I think the flow would be good if we could ask Josie is Josie still here?
Yes, I'm here.
There we go. Oh, there, I'm looking right at you. Oh my gosh. Sorry, Josie.
Yeah,
Please
great.
go ahead.
Of course. And thank you for doing this, and great to see you, Jenna. And just, really thrilled to kind of have this great stimulating kind of dialogue. Lots of ideas are being nurtured here. So really appreciate it. So I have a question that kind of is a little bit broader, maybe in some ways than what, like, the public art, where the public art is that you're doing now, because I know that there's a great investment in durability of materials that has evolved over time in terms of like ceramic tile and faceted glass and so on. But the early days of public art, and still continuing on the streets, is paint on walls and paint on panels that is transient. And actually, I've been doing public art myself. One of the things that I do is public art myself. And so to me, that was part of the appeal, although I had fellow friends who didn't want to do it because it was too transient. But now we're in this digital age, and it kind of really impacts all art, of course. But just wondering what your thoughts are about how now, public art, even painted on walls, quickly painted and decomposing in 3 months. Like I did a step mural that faded in months, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it lived on, an image, right? So
Mm-hmm.
what is just kind of like, I'm just wondering, what thoughts you might have about that impact and and what it means for public art.
Yeah, I think there's room for a lot of different ways of expressing public art. And I think what is said in the longevity capability of the work is also important. For example, with these painted murals, so the city has really strict, not strict, but we have definitions of what permanent and temporary is, right? And so we divide everything into these two categories. Temporary is anything that's less than a year, and permanent is anything after that, to a certain degree. And it gets a little bit more complicated in that, how it got there and whatever, but let's just say it's temporary versus permanent. The thing about I love about temporary art is what the things you could address in the artwork. It could be very contemporary issues, like, you know, what's happening now. You create an artwork about it, it's about now, and, you know, to really engage those conversations. So it's something that may not be relevant or necessary, you know, 5 years from now, because, you know, the topic has changed or evolved or become something different. So you know, creating works that are temporary, I think is key in terms of, you know, what's in the environment, what's in the public art environment. Now, we have come a long way with the maintenance of artworks and the creation of works that you described, you know, and use, you know, the technology of preserving it a little better, whether it be paint on steps or whatever. But I think there is also value in documenting it and showing the work in its documented phase, or it's in digital phase, for example, because the lessons can still be learned, right? So, and it could still be used as a tool. So I think every aspect of the longevity, the temporary aspect, the ephemeral aspect, whether it be on screen or in an Instagram post, all these are there's room for it all. And I think when creating the work, really think about that. Yeah, it's going to be up for a month because it's on paint on steps. How can I document it? How can I tell a story around it that I could give it another type of life later on and still be as effective? Or if you want it to last a little longer, what are some of the applications or care, or what is the maintenance plan to make sure this paint on the step, you know, could last, you know, 5 years instead of just the one? So I think there's many different approaches, but whether it lasts longer than that, I think there's value in something that's ephemeral or short-lived versus something that's permanent and a 30, 40, 50-year thing. So, you know, don't, you know, understanding the limits of the work and create a program around how you use it beyond its actual lifespan was key.
Thank you.
I would love to do this again, Kendall, and just talk about that end part, about what happens. You know, you talk about public art, the end result being an artifact. And you and I have spoken a lot about how these things impact communities and how the impact is durable. That I think that's a whole nother conversation, because there's a lot to unpack there. I'm glad that you raised the question. Marie has actually asked me to ask her question on her behalf, so I will do that. Marie's she's asked a couple of questions. She's asked you, and I'm assuming that this is geared towards your own your opinion rather than any stance. She's asked if you could outline any comparative differences that you see between public art and folk art. And then she's followed up about any internships that might be available that currently open for students.
Yeah, I don't make I don't like to delineate between the public art and folk art and graffiti art and fine art. And, you know, I think they all have an opportunity to, because I see it as what kinds of art could engage in an audience and tell a story. And so how we label it outside of the general art is, for me at this, in my own opinion right now, is irrelevant. So yeah, I don't make that distinction. And I think it's just they are created in different ways, and whether you want to label it, that's up to you. But no, I don't have a preference for or make a distinction of one to the other. And I have a lot of these kinds of conversations, and I always get the question of, what do you think of graffiti? And what do you think of street art? And as a city employee, and our definition of graffiti has to do with vandalism of property. So how I respond to that is one way, but the work itself tends to be quite beautiful, and when it's done well, it sort of is it's speaking to of and for and to a group of people, and I think that conversation is also important. So yeah, no, I don't make that distinction and say, well, whether it be folk or any other art, that there is a preference or a hierarchy between one or the other. In terms of internships, we don't do internships unless they are paid. So really believe that it's an equity thing. So if you could do an internship for free, then you could afford to do it for free. And so that limits who could, build upon that knowledge to a certain degree. So we actually work with CUNY through the CUNY Cultural Core to get all our interns. So, look into that. We have, and every opportunity we had, as many as we could grab and take. And last round we've had 3. So I don't remember when the next round, I think it's actually in September or something like that. So if you are able to tap into that, then by all means, tap into that and send out a special note saying that I know it's a rigorous application process, but we are sponsors of that, so we get to get a little bit of extras, I think. So yeah, that's the stance and the opportunity when it comes to internships.
Okay, next up is to put on your working hat. Stuart Lee, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I gotta find the question.
You're a little
Thank
further
you.
up.
I found it. I guess my question was more sort of administrative. Working within a government institution as an artist, do you feel like you have to justify the need or the importance of art, public art? And what feedback or lessons have you learned from that pair program that you talked about embedding artists, like how to communicate with non-artists or government? Has that helped how you approach getting more funding and more, more projects?
Yeah, so the justification period for us have gone a long time ago, because it and that usually comes in when people are just starting their programs, and we see that a lot in other cities and municipalities throughout the country who are trying to start a program or trying to use public art or any kind of artwork that requires funding from the local governments. Why is it important, and why, and we always get, and even we still get it now, but it's not from the people with the money. We get it from other types of constituents. Like, there's potholes in the street. How we doing, art here when, we could fill in these potholes? And we have to explain, well, this is completely different money. And if you don't get the art, you're not going to necessarily get your holes filled in the ground. So so we don't have to do much of that anymore, thank goodness. And the reason why we don't have to do anymore is because people see the benefits of having artwork on a very kind of surface level. It's as embellishment. It sort of it could make otherwise mundane looking structures or places more beautiful that reflect the community on that level. On a higher level, it instills civic pride, and you do the economic development kind of thing. I mean, there's many different reasons. So, and in terms of the peer program, you must understand that these are embedding artists in non-art spaces. These are not art people. These are people who, again, don't necessarily know or care about it. So but they see the value of it firsthand. They may have exhausted ways of communicating with their constituents, and this may seem like a last resort for some of them, and be like, oh my goodness, I hadn't thought of it that way, and I hadn't, so that benefits them. It's sort of almost speaking the language of that agency with an artist, because they see the benefits of that. So a lot of the pairs that we've done, a lot of the agencies want a second pair artists want to do it over again, because they have. Let me go back a little bit. So to be considered for an agency to do a pair program, we have to get buy-in from the commissioner level. So this is the highest individual in that particular agency, because it requires that the artist is really embedded. So they're privy to quote unquote top secret information about the agency in order to really assist that agency in resolving whatever that issue that agency might want the artist to resolve. So that's key. So we got a lot of agencies saying we want to do, and we're not able to do more than 4 a year. We don't have the capacity to go beyond that. So that's the limit. And then the calls are, no, they're not up anymore, but we put a call out to the world and say, you have to be an artist and you have to be in New York, because it requires, to be considered for pair. And we ask the agency to provide some challenges and opportunities of the agency. So like what's up, what's going on? What are some of the problems that you want to resolve? And we leave it to the artist to come up with a framing question. So it's not just sort of hiring an artist to do a mural about some issue, but to sort of, the artist is understanding what the agency does to a certain extent, asking, a question that needs to be investigated within that agency. And that's what the agency is seeing. And the artist we go through the process of selecting an artist. The first few months, 4 months or so, is just research, meaning that the artist is embedded, going to meetings, talking to whomever they want to talk to really get an understanding. And then that now formulates an idea on a concept that is driven by an art practice. So that's why, that's why this is, and again, it's easy for New York to do this because we see art everywhere. Culture is ingrained within our society here. So it's easy to see the benefits of that on all these levels. And so it's not a hard sell. It's not anymore anyway. Not for us.
If you have not been following the chat, there's some info about Cultural Core internships. They've been chosen for this year. Marie, thank you for asking. They've been chosen for this year, but if you're interested in applying for the next academic year, you can send an email to culturalcore@cuny.edu. And if you don't, you can always reach out to us and we'll get you that info. So we've had a number of students participate, and it's been a great experience for them. Michael, you are up next. Do you want to ask your question, or would you like me to?
I can do it. Hi, Jenna. Kendall, thanks so much for this talk this evening. Really find it super informative. I have a question about private owned public space and the art on display in that arena. Does your agency oversee that art? And how does that play into everything that you spoke about this evening? Thank you so much.
Yeah, not so much. If it's private space, we don't, but we do oversee if it's privately funded on public space, then we get involved. Or even if the private organization wants to have a fair and open process, then we're willing to go through that process to select an artist for them. We have done that as well. But jurisdictionally, then no, if it's on private property, then we don't get involved because it's not city property. So welcome.
Okay. From Grace. How do you ensure balance. Oh, we talked about this. I love this question, Grace. How do you ensure balance and fairness in public arts funding across such a geographically large city?
That's a fantastic question. We do the work. And when I say we do the work, we really, we don't, there's such an immense diversity that is special to New York, right? And so we have a concerted effort for every single panel. So our process is that we don't handpick anybody for anything. So we always have a panel process, which means that it's comprised of arts professionals and community folks and elected officials and all that kind of thing. And from the artists that we consider, we make sure there is a balance of diversity, whether it be in gender identification or race, or even class level, if you want to even think about that. So we make sure, and level of experience, we make sure that is balanced within every single project and panel that we select. We select, right? And communities that are very well defined, we tilt that balance towards that community as much as possible as well. So that means that the people who are going to be selecting the artists represent that community. That means the artists that are going to create the work in that community is represented by that community. And again, I don't want to go into I just use the word community in very general terms. I mean, that's a loaded word in and of itself, but we do the work, and we have to do the work there. A lot of times, and I'm going to take the opportunity to say this here, is that people always think that you need experience to do public art, and most other agencies you do, but for us, not so much. We create a process in that whoever you are, however you label yourself as an artist, you are able to work with us on a project. So from things we don't look at when we review artists, we don't look at your resume to see where you've shown the work and how much work you've done. And we don't require that you have public art experience. And some of the artists never even put a piece of work outside so that's not something that we look at. So all that plays into the equity balance of what we do. And so again, it's a literal, let's see who we're looking at, who is represented, how they're represented, and whatnot. And when they are not, when they don't have the level of experience to even submit work or understand how to document their work, then we do workshops in those particular communities to give those artists a fighting chance to be part of that process as well. So yeah, so we do a lot of things to make sure that it's balanced. And I'm going to do a little plug for ourselves here. Last year we received a special award from the Public Design Commission, who is in charge of all who's takes on the collection of the city, for our diversity in the artwork and in the representation of the people who created the artwork. So I'm proud of that.
Well, I hate to say it, but we're coming up on the end of our time together, at least for this go round. I'm going to reel you back in, Kendall, at some point. I always enjoy these conversations, and I think it's been a great opportunity to kick off the fall semester with something engaging and thought-provoking, as well as practical. I can guarantee that there are a number of our students now that are thinking a little bit differently about their potential career trajectory post-degree. There's a lot of incredibly interesting and rewarding work to be done. Thank you so much for taking the time out to spend your evening with us. I'm always grateful. And thanks to all of our attendees. So Jorge, thanks for for sticking around. All of our new students and all of our returning, a few alum I've seen.
Now I want to say one more thing.
Please.
Yeah, and so I know this. Most of you are, maybe the majority of you are museum studies. We see. What I see, what I'm doing is working within the museum that is New York City. all the same aspects that you think about in a collection, in curating a space and speaking to a particular audience, or speaking of a particular subject as you're curating. This is the same thing that we do. Our museum is just not inside a confined space, but it is equal to some of the things that you're doing. So some of you may think, well, what does this public art to do with museum studies? It's the same. We're in the same field here. So it's just a different kind of space. I just wanted to put that out there.
And you're getting a ton of appreciation in the chat. So thanks to everyone. My understanding from Molly that we'll have a link hopefully for the recording that we will certainly share out. And I hope everyone has an excellent start to their fall semester.
And thank you for the invitation. I enjoyed speaking to you all. Thank you.